So good evening. Glad that you all can make it tonight. We're doing a series on Jewish parenting. Thought it would be nice to gather together as, obviously Andrea and I have had a baby and a bunch of you have recently had children and other people in the community have had children, to do a nice kind of mini series about, parenting within the Jewish tradition, both kind of some conceptual stuff and some practical things that hopefully would be helpful and hopefully would be kind of thought-provoking in terms of thinking about, this endeavor that we're engaging with, which is now being, not just Jews, but Jewish parents to Jewish children, which is incredibly exciting. But is a new phase of life. And as with most things in life, if you just kind of do it without thinking about how you're doing it, you kind of all of a sudden realize, like, what am I doing? Or kind of you get caught up in it a little bit. So I really thought it would be helpful just to kind of step back, think a little bit together, and hopefully give a bit of intentionality to what we're all embarking on, and hopefully allow us to all be a bit better as Jewish parents. What I'm hoping we can do is, obviously the last class was more so, but I'm hoping kind of as we progress, we'll have a bit more kind of exchange between each other as part of it, where we can kind of share experiences, ideas, reflections, as well as, to ask questions. But hopefully it's a way for us to kind of learn from each other, in addition to the things that I'll be sharing from Jewish sources. So that's kind of a way of introducing tonight's class. Tonight's class is going to be, let me say this. Last week's class, we focused a bit more on the whole idea of kind of becoming parents, right? Of having children. Tonight, we're going to talk a bit more about Jewish approaches to being a parent. And then next week, we'll do a bit more practical things, kind of some nuts and bolts with Jewish parenting. Certainly, at the end of the day, in 3 classes, we're not being completely comprehensive by any stretch. We're hopefully at least touching on kind of some different elements to Jewish thought and Jewish practice as it relates to being Jewish parents. And like I said, hopefully in that way, it is kind of the start of a conversation, the start of kind of this new moment, in each of our lives to really be thinking and giving thought about. And hopefully we'll have, future opportunities to continue the conversation, as it were. So I'm going to be doing probably less sources this week than we did last week, but I'd like to go into them a bit more in depth than we did previously. But I'm going to start by looking at a source that we considered last week, which was the source of the commandment, right? The mitzvah to have children. And this is from Genesis. So it's from the very beginning, the first chapter, where it said that God blessed them and God said to them, Piru orvu umilu et haaretz, right? Be fruitful and multiply, or here it says be fertile and increase, and fill the earth. And so here we have the origin of the idea that there is a mitzvah, right? There is a religious imperative to have children. We saw last week that that's codified, right, in the halakha as actually having ideally 2 children, 1 boy and 1 girl. Obviously, we can't control ultimately what we have, but at least conceptually, the idea that it's in plural, piru, right, it's in plural. So the idea is that you have more than 1 child, right? The idea of, replacement theory at the very least. And then, as we discussed, right, there's also a notion of even having more children, right? The more the better, right? And kind of the religious value in having children and so forth, that goes even beyond, in theory too, which is why some people have, bundles of Jewish children, though it's certainly not, obligated. And ultimately, that's a very personal choice that families make, kind of what's appropriate for them. But all of that focused on kind of the biological birthing of a child. While today, I'm going to focus a bit more on what you do with that child once you've had them. And there it's interesting because there's a discussion that's had about, has one, in a sense, fulfilled their religious imperative, as it were, of having children by simply birthing a child. And there's a bit of discussion about that, because some say that technically speaking, one has perhaps fulfilled the obligation, while others say that, in a sense, if you have children and then you, shall we say, abandon them, that you haven't really properly fulfilled it, that it's not simply to have a child, it's to raise a child as well. One of the kind of more recent common, rabbis who made that point was Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in the 19th century. And he wrote, he was a rabbi in Germany, he wrote that, if all the Torah wanted you to do was to have children, it would have simply said, be fruitful. The fact that it says not only be fruitful, it also said, and multiply, he understood that kind of double language to be inclusive of not only having the child, but also the responsibility to raise the child too. And so there's kind of, perhaps even within the idea of having children, there's already this notion that it's not just enough to biologically, produce a offspring, but it also is this kind of responsibility that you also then have to take care of it to make sure that it, survives, feeding it and clothing it and ultimately raising it in a particular way. Be that as it may, whether kind of the mitzvah of having children does or doesn't include, the imperative of to then raise the child, there absolutely is a religious imperative in the Jewish tradition to not simply have children, but also to raise them, to educate them. And that's based on a very well-known verse. We say it every day in Jewish prayers and even before we go to bed at night, right? Which is found in the Shema. And so this is taken from Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 7. And here it says, Vishinantam levanecha, impress them upon your children. And this, of course, is talking about the idea of the Torah, right? That you shall serve God. So it says, and we'll look a little bit later actually at the entire paragraph closely, because I think there's a lot in there for us to pick apart and to think about. But at a very basic level, right, here we have the obligation, again, to use that, that notion of mitzvah, to educate one's children. Vishinantam levanecha, you shall teach your children. And so here we see that the Torah, already says that there is that imperative. And that probably is the source for the fact that Jews are, so dedicated to the idea of education. We'll talk about this a bit more later, but in terms of how it works, but even in ancient times, Jews had a school system. It was known as what was established by the Beit Rabban, and it was a Rabban Gamliel, established in Talmudic times, Mishnaic times, a school system. And this was a form of public education, so that all Jewish children would be educated in the land of Israel. And so we see that the commitment to education goes back quite far. And you actually have quite a number of verses in the Torah that reiterate this commitment to education. You have quite a lot of it actually around the Exodus from Egypt, where there's kind of several different verses that talk about, and you shall tell your children, this is what happened. Or it says, when your children ask you, what is this? This is what you should say to them. And of course, we incorporate those verses into what we know as the four sons, right? So on the Seder night in the Haggadah, where we have the four sons and they ask questions, those questions weren't, in a sense, made up by the rabbis when they put together the Haggadah, but are lifting biblical verses that kind of phrase or formulate questions in slightly different ways around the Exodus. So again, you have many different verses that talk about education. You have verses regarding Avraham, where Avraham is told that he must pass the tradition on to his children. So you have this, I would say, this prioritization throughout the Torah, that whatever we have received, our knowledge of God, our following of God's laws, that we're not meant to just kind of do it for ourselves, but that we have a duty to transmit it to our children as well. And that is kind of part and parcel, that simply to have a child, but then not educate them, to teach them how to live as Jews, is failing in our kind of duty as Jewish people, right? That idea of the link in the chain, to really ensure that we are passing it on from one generation to the next. And it's a major responsibility, but it's a great privilege, as well, which we'll think about the kind of that idea of privilege perhaps a bit later, and certainly a bit more next week, when we can kind of think about some of the practicalities about how you do this, and kind of challenges with doing it, and and so forth. But we'll kind of feed into that a little bit later. What I think is interesting is that while the Torah in this context is obviously talking about our commitment to God, and again, we'll look at all the verses a little bit later, the Talmud does not limit it, the sages did not limit it to religious study either. They actually expanded it beyond it. And that's from a well-known source in the Talmud, where this is in the Tractate of Kiddushin, which is a tractate of marriage. So it also talks in there a bit about children. And it quotes a Baraita, which is a Mishnaic type of text. And it says the following. It says, the sages taught in a Baraita, a father is obligated with regard to his son to circumcise him. So there's a mitzvah, fathers have to do Brit Milah to their sons, right? This is why some people actually do Brit Milah themselves if they can. I did not do that. I had the Moel do it for me. But it's the father's mitzvah. He also has a mitzvah to redeem his son. So if your firstborn son is a son, and it was natural birth, and neither parent is the child of a Kohen or Levi, then you have the mitzvah to do Brit Milah. So Andrew and I did it. I know that John and Ploma also did a Pidyon Haben, a redemption of the firstborn for their son. Alex is a Levi, so did not. He got to save his 5 silver coins. But there's also that mitzvah. And then also the mitzvah to teach him Torah. So there we have, right, the religious instruction, and also to marry him to a woman, right? So here you have this extension, right, that, as a parent, you should marry your children off, that like, you should be a bit involved in helping them find a life partner, and to teach him a trade, right? That there's also an obligation for parents to teach their child a profession. And so this obviously is going beyond religious, areas. And some say a father is also obligated to teach his son to swim. Why to swim? Because if a person doesn't know how to swim, God forbid, they could drown, right? So in part of that obligation to have children, it's not enough to just have them if they then can't survive. Essentially, you need to teach your child how they can take care of themselves, how they'll be able to survive into adulthood. Rabbi Yehuda says, any father who does not teach his son a trade teaches him banditry, right? And so here, there's this kind of strange statement, right, that you're teaching your child how to steal if you don't teach them a trade. And then Talmud explains, it doesn't mean you're literally teaching them to steal, but obviously if you don't teach them how to provide for themselves, they have no recourse. They're going to end up, engaging in all kinds of funny business in order to find a way to survive. So this is a great source because this really expands the whole notion of education, even beyond, the religious sphere, to the idea that you should teach your children how to care for themselves, right? Whether it's kind of survival skills, but also professional skills as well. So you see this kind of, shall we say, in our day and age, it's religious obligation to, ensure that your child, gets a PhD or goes to medical school, so that they can, become good Jewish children. So I don't know if any of you are laughing at that, but it's but an important point. So the point is that education, a broad education is important and is part of a parent's responsibility. So it's not simply to be like, oh, you want to go, it's your responsibility. No, as parents, it's our job to kind of facilitate and to encourage and to enable our children to get whatever education they need in order to ultimately take care of themselves. So again, the reason for this may relate to the idea of the obligation to have children. And again, if you have a child, you also have to teach them how to survive, right? And then you also have the religious notion, right, of the idea that you must educate your children, right? And that perhaps that's in more of a religious kind of education. But be that as may, the responsibility as a Jewish parent is vast in that respect, to really make sure that we are providing okay, we're back. Okay, so there is this, kind of vast responsibility when it comes to education that kind of covers all of these different areas. So that can seem a bit daunting, but is amazing about kind of the traditional Jewish commitment to education. So what I think I'd like to do is to reflect a little bit more about kind of what is the Jewish view about how one goes about doing this education. So what I think I'll start with is a point that relates to, shall we say, the mitzvah itself of education. Now, the obligation, as we saw, right, is incumbent upon, well, here it says a father, but more broadly on parents, right, to educate their children. Now, that is a personal obligation, right? Meaning it's an obligation on us. However, there's a principle in Jewish tradition that says that you can, with some mitzvot, you can fulfill your responsibility through another person's action. And so if somebody does something on your behalf, it can be considered as if you have done it yourself. Now, it doesn't apply to all mitzvot. It can't be like, Rabbi, you pray for me. No, everyone has that's your own obligation to pray for yourself. But when it comes to things that you have to do for your child, right, there someone else can do it on your behalf. So for example, you can have someone else do the circumcision for you. Even though it's your commandment, you don't have to do it yourself. You can appoint someone to do it on your behalf, and it'll be considered as if you have done it. Now, there is a notion that says it's better to do a mitzvah yourself than to do it through a messenger. And so that's why I've heard of some people who try to sometimes do things on their own, even though technically they can appoint somebody to do it. So the way that plays out with education is that, as I mentioned before, historically, Jews have set up schools, and that's completely appropriate, right? You can appoint someone to educate your child on your behalf, right? And certainly if you think that you're not, you couldn't do it on your own, right? Not about to homeschool, right? So that's completely appropriate and completely fine. But what I think the point to add is that there is this notion of yoter bo mi bishlucho, right? That it's better to do it yourself than a messenger. So that doesn't mean homeschool. What that means is that you can't simply outsource your responsibility to educate. Meaning you can, But the point is, you shouldn't outsource it completely, right? You should retain some sense of responsibility of saying, yes, I'm outsourcing it, but it's my mitzvah, right? It's my duty. I also want to do it myself, right? And so that's where comes in this idea that like parents should make sure that they are also participating in their child's education. So again, this is far off from where we are with babies. I'm really just trying to like set the stage for it, right? But that there is an element which says that yes, you child might go to school, they may study, they may learn, but you should do it a bit yourself too. So have some time where you sit down with your child and you study. Ultimately when they're big enough, some Chumash with them, or Mishnah, or Talmud, or something else, whatever it is, but where you kind of say, it's my mitzvah. So yes, someone else is doing it, but I want to also do it myself, right? And I think that's an important, besides for the practical implications of like actually doing it, I think conceptually it's really important, because I think what sometimes happens is that parents say, particularly, I think sometimes it can happen in a Jewish context, particularly is, I sent my kids to Jewish school, or I sent my kids to cheder, like they've, like that's how I've done it. And if they're not learning, it's like the school's fault or it's the cheder's fault, and maybe it is their fault also. But the point is a parent should also do it a bit themselves too, because it's ultimately your mitzvah, right? There's something, a value of doing it yourself, not to mention how beautiful it is to kind of study with your child. But I think that is important because it also means that like you are really engaging your child in that. And that's meaningful in terms of the relationship you build with your child around their Jewish education, and shows them that it's important to you. And I think is hopefully personally quite satisfying to kind of know that you are taking a level of responsibility in your child's Jewish education. And I think part of the reason that that's so important is that it empowers you, right? It means that you need to think about what do you want your child to learn about Judaism or about Jewish identity. What is it that you'd like to teach your child that maybe something the school doesn't cover, but you think they really should know, and you want to kind of teach it to them, or you want your child to learn that thing that maybe they learn at school, but you want them to like learn it from your perspective, or to think about it the way that you think about it, right? So to kind of not to simply outsource it and leave it to their teachers, but to say that like, I'm a Jewish adult, I want to teach them, right? That's important to me. And obviously this all comes back to the idea of, well, sometimes many parents don't feel capable of doing that. So that's a good encouragement, I think, as we become parents, to say, if there are areas that you feel like you don't know enough about, or certain skills that you don't have, well, maybe this is the good opportunity to kind of work on those things, to study those things once you can get a bit more sleep, if that ever happens, so that, as your child grows up, you will be able to take it a more active, direct role, personal kind of engagement in their Jewish education. And I'll just say, as the rabbi, that's what I'm here for, to help you to do that. So if there are areas that you'd like to know more about, or areas that the skills that you want to have, or you ultimately want to be able to do something with your children and don't feel quite up to it, engage with me on that, because then I can kind of help you to kind of be able to do that and to really kind of feel that personal connection with the education that you will provide to your child. So I think that's kind of the point I want to make just about the mitzvah of education, is that yoter bo mi bishlucho. It's better yourself than your child, right? There's an added kind of religious value in that. So yes, we're going to outsource our education because we can't just do it on our own. We have jobs, our kids need to kind of go to proper schools, but don't outsource it completely. It's ultimately your responsibility, not the school's responsibility. I mean, if the school's not doing a good job, find another school. But ultimately, it's your duty, and so you need to kind of make sure, but ultimately you should just enjoy it. It's your religious obligation, and it's nice to kind of take it on yourself, not just to have someone do it on your behalf. So that's kind of food for thought. I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts about things that they would actually want to teach their child themselves and not necessarily rely or kind of outsource to someone else. This is really just an opportunity to share. I'm kind of curious. I think it's helpful for all of us to kind of think about it. Say, are there things that actually, now I want that to be the thing that I teach my child. I don't know if anyone's ever given it any thought, but I'm curious if anyone has, or kind of even now, just as I talk about it, thinking, yeah, that's something I really look forward to kind of teaching my child. Don't be bashful. Yeah, go for it, guys.
For me, it would be probably putting on tefillin with Aaron when he's a bit older, quite a way away, but that's one I think is really nice to do with your dad.
Do you remember? Did your dad teach you how to do it?
No. Did he? I think we learned in Cheder.
You learned in Cheder, right? But it's nice to teach your son. I remember my dad teaching me to do it. And that's very. You really feel that. I think that sense of like transmission. That like this is like a skill I have. I'm not giving you this skill.
That's right. Yeah. I think we learn it at Sunday school. Yeah.
Lovely.
But because we learned most of the prayers we learned there. That's the tefillah. And then I think, I know my brother teaches his kids the Shema. They're very young. They're like 3 and 5 or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know what they learn in Israel at that age. But I think that's like the first thing. And then I think tefillin is very nice for a boy to learn from their dad.
Yeah.
That was my thought. But that's a while away.
That is a while away. That's okay. We're kind of thinking.
We're planning ahead.
That's good. What do you think, Paloma? Any thoughts?
You've kind of made me think about something that I hadn't really thought about before, actually. I have a boy, and there are certain things in Jewish religion that a boy does that a girl doesn't do that I wouldn't know how to do, but maybe have observed others do thousands of times. And I don't want to be an inactive Jewish parent in his life. I don't want Jono to do everything with him. It's not that I don't want, that came out wrong.
It will all be Ashkenazi.
No, I just mean like, so I'm sharing quite privately, but something that I talk to Jono about quite a lot is I'd really like to be able to read from the Torah. And I know that that's not allowed in like Orthodox practice, but that doesn't mean that I couldn't learn. Or for example, like I know that at SMP they have the Megillah reading, which is different, but it's the same kind of type of practice. But I've never been taught, so I don't know how to do it. And like something that would be really nice is that if when he's like preparing his bar mitzvah or a reading for Cheder, that I can help him as much as Jono can help him. But I can't teach him something that I don't have the confidence to do myself.
Yeah, that's really cool. I actually, that's really, really interesting. It's like a way to like make sure that both of you can be engaged in teaching him and not have everything be kind of like gender divided in that way. That's really
so I don't know. I guess I need to think about how we overcome that, but I probably need to upskill myself in order to be able to do that.
All of these skills can be learned and taught, Paloma. So happy to
I just have lots of memories of my dad walking around the house with a Walkman when he was becoming Khatan Baruch.
You could teach
that is one way. That is one way to learn how to do it. But there's a bit more kind of there's different ways. There's different ways to learn. But I think that's a nice idea, right? Like, in general, right?
And there are just lots of things that I won't know because I'm a woman. Like that, I will know like the basics, that men put on tefillin and all those things. But there might be, I don't know what he needs to do when he puts on tzitzit. I wouldn't know what to. And I don't want him to be like, I always need to ask dad. I could ask mum as well. I don't know. That's just a thought that I was thinking about when you were talking.
That's good. See, it's good. I find this helpful. It makes me think, oh, okay, these are classes I need to teach. Okay, good.
Endigamos, you can teach them endigamos.
Yeah, I will teach
Jono,
him.
you need to learn it so that you can also teach him Bendigamos.
Bendigamos.
Good. Anybody else have any thoughts of things they would want to kind of like teach themselves to their child?
I'll try to say something before the baby starts screaming because he wants to go to bed. But I always think about what you said, Tom, actually about your mom and how she used to read the Parsha with you guys on Friday nights. And I think that's really, really nice. Like it's a nice tradition, a nice way to sort of be the one that transmits that to the kids, while they're little.
Yeah, it's nice. I remember she would always sit on the sofa Friday night and kind of go through the Parsha, and we would kind of like sometimes sit up with her or whatever. And she wasn't necessarily always like teaching us, but like even like observing her doing it was, important. And I'm going to talk about the idea of observing your parents do things a bit more next week. But yeah, that's really good, Andrea. I like that. Thanks. Yeah, Alex.
I'd like to be able to teach him to read Hebrew. I had the the luck, I guess, of going to a Jewish primary school and having it taught to me. But I don't think. I mean, I don't know whether we'll what we're going to be doing, where we're going to be, if we'll be around a Jewish primary school or not. And so it's the kind of thing I'd like to be able to do and teach him to read it properly. But the other thing I think that would be good for both of us to focus on is kashrut, because it's something that everyone can be involved in, because it's something we're doing 2, 3, probably 4, 5 times a day, depending on how hungry he gets. But it's a really kind of basic thing that we're all doing together, and would be it's a really powerful thing to talk about. And not just we don't eat that because we don't eat that, but we don't know why we don't do these things. And really kind of, I don't want to get under the skin of it. It's probably a bad metaphor, but really talking about the kind of the underlying reasons and the the laws and the different things, and really exploring that, because it's something that will be it's so all-encompassing when you're sort of out there in the world, especially if you're not in a working in a Jewish organization or going to a Jewish school, or especially when they grow up and goes to university, or moves out. It becomes that kind of it touches on every part of your life. So it would be certainly something that would be fascinating to kind of work through with, because I don't think I remember it was just how we lived our life. And then I went to a non-Jewish secondary school, and suddenly there was a whole host of different choices there, and it was very strange. It was just kind of kosher by default, not kosher by choice, if you see what I mean. And so like making it a very active, decisive thing, as opposed to just being a kind of never having even heard of some of the things you shouldn't eat, if you see what I mean.
Right. Yeah, no, that's really good. The idea of kind of like talking to your kids about like not just what you do, but like why do we do these different things, and even the Hebrew is interesting. I mean, kids only learn Hebrew at a certain age. Parents could already be teaching them the Aleph Bet in advance, even if they're going to go to a Jewish school. But I think just that idea of like, and I think that's what's interesting already, is right? There's a lot of stuff you can be teaching your child yourself, right? Like it's not just about school, and even some of these things you're talking about, even if you go to Jewish school, you don't necessarily learn them, because the school might focus on certain things, or who knows, but, and that's why I think it's helpful to kind of think about the things that, from your life that you wanted to know, or you don't know so much about, and you wish you did. That to kind of like drive the thought process on what is it that I'd like to make sure my child knows, and I want them to learn it from me, and I think that's one of the things that's really beautiful about, about this tradition of Jewish education, is that it's meant to be, in that sense, intergenerational. It's meant to be like, this is your child, you teach your child. Yes, they'll learn in school, but like you should teach your child, yourself and feel that that's like your responsibility, your blessing. You have this beautiful child. Like, it's what a wonderful thing for you to be able to do it. And I know in some communities, I don't know if anybody does it here, but I know in America it's pretty popular. They have like oftentimes like on a Saturday night or something on these early Shabbats where people will come back to synagogue, and then they have like a parent-child learning night, with pizza or whatever. And again, it's like it's this way to like for parents to teach their children directly and not only kind of just have the kids learn in school. But again, it doesn't even have to be that formal, but it's more just like that idea of like giving thought and doing it with intentionality, which I think is really lovely. So what I'd like to do with kind of the next few minutes we have is I want to go back and just look at the paragraph of Shema with you, because it talks a lot about different things that relate to education that I think are helpful. So let's just take a quick look over here, and I'll just read it in the English. I'm sure everyone knows the Hebrew and the English, but I'll just do it in English. So we say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." Right? Most important verse in the Torah, right, in terms of Jewish faith. Okay, and then we say, the Torah says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." Right? So this idea of loving God, we'll get back to that a little bit later. And then it says, "Take to heart these instructions which I charge you this day." And so here it's talking about the mitzvot, right? These instructions, right? So you should take them to heart. They should be on your heart. And then it says, "Vishinantam levanacha," right? You shall impress them upon your children. And here, this is where I want to look at. It says, "V'dibarta bam," you shall recite them, "b'shiftecha b'beitacha uvlatecha v'aderech," when you are at home and when you are away. "B'shoch b'chav kumecha," when you lie down and when you wake up. And then it says, "Ukshartam laot al yadacha v'ayulet otafot beinacha." They should bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol between your eyes. Right? That's about tefillin. So, John, right? Interesting that's the idea that came to your mind, because that's, shall we say, the first mitzvah which is mentioned after the notion of educating your children is the mitzvah of tefillin. And in fact, this text from the Torah is in the tefillin, right? With other ones, but it's actually in the tefillin. So they're definitely wrapped up with each other, no pun intended. And then it says, and you should also write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gate. So again, that's what we have in our mezuzot, is the Shema. So that verse that we had looked at before, I want to look at now a bit more in detail, where you say, "You'd impress them upon your children, recite them when you stay at home and when you are away." So this, to me, kind of drives home again this point that we said, is that, yes, it's when you're out of the house that education happens, but it also happens at home, right? That home is a really important place for education. And so, yes, education will take place at school. Education will take place at the synagogue, right? Because there they'll come, they'll participate, they'll learn, they'll kind of learn the prayers, the customs, the melodies, and so forth. Right? They'll become part of a community, right? So that's going to happen outside, but part of it also is at home, right? So I think the Torah here is making the point that the home is actually a hugely important setting for education. That actually, if education doesn't happen in your home, then what you're actually doing is creating almost like this divide where it's like, you live one life in this setting, another life in that setting, another life in that setting. But what you actually want to do is integrate these things together, right? So sometimes a lot of people, they act one way when they're, at home, but when they go on holiday, they do something completely different. And that's confusing, right? That's something which, it can be challenging, and to think about, to say that, like, our lives are not bifurcated, right? There has to be an integrated part to our life. Otherwise, for children, that can be really complicated. And I think the point that this Shema is by saying, when you stay at home and when you are away, is saying this, this idea of teaching your children has to be constant. It has to be in different contexts. It has to be something which is consistent. If something starts becoming kind of all over the place, here, there's something else, there's something completely different, it kind of gives a sense of, so what really is important, why is that? So sometimes we can explain why things are one way in one context, in another context, but the point is you have to be engaged with that. And yet you have to be thinking about that. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that next week, because I think it's a really important topic, a really important notion to be thinking about. But obviously the point also that you have over here then says when you lie down and when you get up. So this is the source for the idea that we say the Shema twice a day, that you're supposed to say the Shema in the morning and you're supposed to say the Shema at night. So in one sense, that's what the Torah is telling us, say the Shema twice a day. But obviously on a basic level, the Torah is literally talking about when you lie down and when you get up, right? This idea that almost from morning to evening, right? That our responsibility as parents does not rest, except for when we're sleeping. Our responsibility as parents is constant. It's always, and that we need to be regularly thinking about it. And I think, to me, one of the best ways to kind of do that is actually to have a level of ritual around sleep and wake, and it's part of our tradition already. So of course there is a tradition that every night before you go to sleep you say Shema, and so to say the Shema with your children, so the tradition is that you say the whole paragraph, but with the child just enough to say the first line of Shema, if you want to say the second line, but just that that should be part of that. And traditionally that was something that the mothers would do, that they would say Shema with their children. There's actually a story of that I know about my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather was a rabbi in America in the 20th century, kind of at the height of his career, in the years around the Holocaust. And after the Holocaust, he got permission from the American government to travel back to Europe. And he was given an American Army uniform, so he could kind of travel freely and to do his best to kind of help people who had survived the Holocaust. And he had a story where on one occasion he met somebody who told him that that before the Holocaust he had brought his children to a monastery because he knew they would be killed, and so basically brought to the nuns and asked that they would essentially hide his children during the war. And the guy said, after the war, he went back over there to collect his children, and they told him to get lost. They said, we don't know what you're talking about. So the guy said he doesn't know what to do. His kids are in this, in this convent or whatever, this monastery, and he can't get them out. So my great grandfather went with him to the monastery, and in an army uniform, so they couldn't say no, and they went in there, and he said they went into the dining room, and the nun said, "Okay, look around. Where's your kid?" So the guy said he started to cry because I can't. He says it was 5 years ago. He says it was a very small child. He says my wife died in the Holocaust. He says I can't recognize the kid anymore. He says, what am I supposed to do? So the nun said, leave. You can't see if you can't find them, then you have to go. So the story goes, my great grandfather, basically before they left, thought to himself, 1.5 million Jewish children have just been murdered. We can't lose any more. So he said, we want to look one more time. So they went back in, and at that point, the kids were apparently getting ready for bed. And my great grandfather just kind of stood there among the kids and said out loud, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. And one of the kids, poked his head up and started to cry and started calling for his mommy. And the guy said, that's my kid. And they took the child and left. The kid had grown up hearing the Shema every night before he went to bed. And, even all those years later, remembered his mother. And it's a beautiful story because it means that this is something Jewish parents have done, for millennia. Put your child to bed, you say the Shema with them. It should be the last thing that they hear, in that sense, before they go to bed. It's a beautiful, beautiful tradition. And I would definitely encourage people to do that, to say the Shema, at least the first line of Shema with their child. The other one is when the kid wakes up in the morning. So there's a tradition, and everyone should be doing this as well, as saying Modeh Ani, right? Modeh Ani lefanecha, right? Right, where we thank God for the new day, right? For returning our souls to us, Shehakazarta binishmati, right? For returning your soul to me, and thanking God for his faith. And so when we wake up in the morning, right, we say this. So you should say this to your child also. I actually wrote a whole melody for Dove already. I have my own version of it. But to wake up and say Modeh Ani with your child is a beautiful, beautiful thing to do. And again, it's this idea that, the last thing they hear when they go to bed is Shema, is Hebrew, is something Jewish. When they wake up in the morning, again, something Jewish, something that is meaningful. And it just, again, it's that idea of in the morning and at night, from the day, beginning of the day till the end, to impress that upon our children and to share in that with them, I think is an amazing thing to do. So I think we can, in that sense, kind of really fulfill this notion, right, in the Shema of taking the responsibility of educating our child as a personal obligation, in addition to kind of outsourcing it. And one of the ways we do that is really being quite literal in our reading of it, of the lying down and getting up, and really doing something educational with your child when you put them to bed and when they wake up in the morning. It's a beautiful thing to do. I don't know if anybody does it. If anybody doesn't know the words, I'd be very happy to send them to you. It's a really wonderful thing to do for your child. The last point I want to make from here, and we're going to kind of pick up with this next week, and this is a point that Rabbi Sachs, a blessed memory, made. He says, how do you teach a child? How do you teach a child? We have this commandment to teach your children. So how do you teach them? Is it just like sitting down with them, opening up a book and teaching to them? This is the key to how you teach your children is found in this paragraph, because this paragraph begins with v'ahavta, a very strange language. It says, you shall love the Lord your God. You should love God. It's easy to command people to do actions. It's hard to commit people to feel things. But here we have this idea of loving God. And Rabbi Sachs says, this is the secret. Because this is the secret. He says, if you love it, then you can teach it to your children. He says, if you don't love it, you can't teach it to your children. He says, whatever you love, your child will love. And so again, we'll focus on this more next week. But this kind of core idea to think about is to say, the things that are really important to you, those are the things that you will be best positioned to communicate to your child. And so it's important to think about what are the things that are really important to you, the things that you love about being Jewish, and those are going to be the things that you are going to be best placed to kind of impart to your child as well. And so I would say to kind of think about, what are the things that you love, that you really want your child to know. That's kind of a helpful kind of thing to think about. Okay, so this is what I'm going to, this is an area I'm going to focus on my child's education, because this is something that I really value, that I really love. There's a lot to talk about, I think, within that. And we'll kind of expand upon that next week, but just kind of in picking up this theme, we're thinking about, okay, I'm going to educate my children myself. So think about what do you love about being Jewish? What's meaningful to you? And then to think about, okay, so how are there ways that I can kind of impart that to my children? Because if you love something, it's a lot easier to teach that to your children. Something that you're not so into, you might not be the best placed person to really kind of bring it to your kids. But if your kid sees that you love it, pretty good chance they'll end up loving it too. Okay, this is where I'm going to kind of pause in terms of some of the sources. Does anyone have any kind of questions or thoughts on anything that we spoke about tonight? Give everyone another second, please. Great. Hi. Go for it, Andrew.
I was just returning to the room.
Oh, return. Okay, great. Good. Did anybody else, or everyone just coming back in to say hi to everyone?
No, I think just that like it really resonates. Like I can see, like when you were talking about that, a lot of things that my mum and dad used to do with us, and it's nice to now that we're in the role that they're in with us, like it's nice to think about how we might do that with our kid.
Can I ask what you remember, like what they? If it's not too
Well,
personal.
I was saying to Jono as you were talking, like my mum always used to do the Shema with us at night time, and I have a really distinct memory of that. And actually, my sister has now started doing it with her kids now that they're old enough. I can remember like doing like practicing like Hebrew reading with my dad on Shabbat after lunch. Like that is like one of the things that we would do. And I guess what you say is that you end up loving what they love on the whole. You update and you modernize and you get exposed to new things, but you know the reason that they teach you traditions is so that or expose you to them is so that you love them. And I don't know, like I guess the S&P is a really good example in my family. Like my dad is not Sephardi, but my mum is like, I want my kids to grow up loving those things as much as I do. And I guess that's why we're actually sitting here right now, is because I love them too. Like you don't think about it like that, but yeah, that is the main drive and why.
That's awesome. Thanks, Paula. John, are you about to say something?
Were you going to say something?
No.
Okay, fine. Good.
Very good. I love the S&P too. A big S&P. I'm an adopted Sephardi.
Fantastic. We all are, except for Alex. He's actually Sephardi. What?
Good to have one.
Yeah. You guys, you have any thoughts, Carla, Alex? Yeah.
No, other than I think those traditions sound really lovely, and I think it's something we're going to start doing.
Yeah, no, I think it's yeah, I haven't really thought about yet what my parents did, trying to separate out what it was that was, as it were, what they actually did and what I'm trying to separate out between, what they did then, what we do now. But it was, I think the Seder always sticks in my head as something hugely important, like a real pivotal point in the year. That was when, we'd hear, that was when the different sort of geographic traditions in the family would really come to the fore. Suddenly my uncle would become very, very Dutch all of a sudden. And, for example, and everyone would argue about which bit of the Haggadah was the right bit of the Haggadah and which random old version of it was in fact accurate, and all those kinds of things. And I don't know, that kind of extra opinion for the number of people around the table kind of, stereotype would come to the fore. But it was always, a kind of chaotic, happy memory. I hope, I don't know, that's probably won't be as chaotic, but it'll certainly be happy.
That's awesome.
It's going to be very fun.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's good. It's an interesting thing when you become the parent to kind of start thinking about, okay, like, what was your experience as a child? What were your parents thinking when they became parents? So, I mean, I'm the fourth child, so by the time they got to me, it's just, they were just, exhausted, but,
Probably true.
Any case, great, guys. So nice studying with you. Really nice just to see everyone and to catch up. And please God, next week we're going to kind of talk about a lot of really cool stuff. So hopefully you guys will be able to make it then. But yeah, until then, look forward to seeing everybody soon. And if anyone wants, we're having stuff on Hanukkah and stuff like that. Obviously a bit hard with kids, but it's great to see everybody. If anybody wants to pop by at some point, let us know. Great to see everyone.
We're probably not going to be here next week.
Oh, definitely not.
Well, we're definitely
to Australia on Monday.
Oh wow!
You what? Sorry.
We're off to Australia on Monday to see
awesome.
See my parents.
All right.
So we'll see you on Zoom.
Okay. Yeah, if it's not a weird hour, depending on how jet lagged we are. We think we arrived just in time, but you've got.
So really, I have to go after volunteering for the Jewish genetics charity.
All right, guys, take it easy. Have a great night.
Okay.
Thanks,
Shalom, can you send if there's a recording of next week, can you send it in case we can't
Yes.
join?
Yeah,
Because
100%.
I really don't know what is going to happen on the aeroplane with
I'll record it and post it.
said child. And Andrea, I have a bedtime routine for you.
Oh, I can't wait. I will call you before you go to Australia.
Okay, lovely.
Take
Bye,
care,
guys.
guys.
Okay, bye.
Bye.